You're tuned in to RX Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to RX Radio this week. You'll be listening to me and only me on this beautiful Wednesday morning. It's funny because, I don't know, as always with the company, there's a lot of things in motion. So rarely do Shallow and my schedule link up, and they've just been all over the fucking place lately. So this is, I don't know if this is part 2 or the other half of the episode that you guys got last week. And the funny thing to me is that Jordan never told me what he recorded and that he wanted me to record like my opinion on the same topic. I heard this from 2 different people that don't work for Prescript, have nothing to do with the podcast. They're just consumers of the podcast. Alan and Elliot told me. I found out in the lab last week. So I got the message, somehow, some way. So as we get into things, I guess we'll pay the bills first. Prescript level 1, the fall semester registration is now closed. If you didn't sign up, you missed your chance. So you can head on over to the website, www.pre-script.com. You can put your email address on the waitlist for the January semester. And when registration goes live for that, you'll get an email with the discount code for our best price on the course. That is the only discount we offer. And that is the lowest price that you will pay. So if you're interested and you missed out on our, what month even is it? I guess that would have been our October semester. It is now November. Next one will be going live in January. So go ahead, get on the wait list, and you'll get our best available price on that. Other than that, Dr. Dwayne Jackson is back with our Nutrition for Body Composition course. Registration for that open on Monday, I believe. So that should be live right now. If you guys are interested, head on over. Registration's live, and you guys can sign up for that right now. I mean, that's it. Other than that, thanks for being here. This week, fueled by nicotine and caffeine, we're going to talk about... So, here's the thing. Last week, you got a very pointed brain dump from Jordan Shallow. Dr. Jordan Shallow, the muscle doc, about the best exercise for each muscle group. And that's great. And then what he kind of put out into the universe was that I would record a similar episode with my opinion on it. And then we'd kind of link up after the fact and see what matched up and what didn't. But as I do with most things in life, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do, which is not that. It's going to be my take on that. So it's not completely different. But I think that between what Jordan recorded last week and this episode, it will be one of those things that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? What he recorded on its own, I'm sure it's great and it holds a lot of value. If I were to just give you kind of the other side of the coin from my opinion, it would be... I think there'd be a lot of kind of interplay. I think there'd be a lot of matchup between probably just about everything that he said and everything that I said, at least in theory. In application, maybe minor differences, because we've been doing this for a long time and we've been doing this side by side for a fucking decade or more now. So with that, the perspective gets a bit more narrowed. And I think we've both refined that very well in our own way over the years. And I think there is a lot of overlap in the way that we think, because maybe I'm biased, but I think the way that we approach things is, it's hard to say the right way, but I'm here talking in a room by myself. So fuck everyone else. I think we think about things in a very similar way because it gets results. I think that's a better way to say it. So that being said, I'm going to take a little bit of a different take on a similar topic. And I'm going to give you, here's the title, Marshall. I just came up with it. 4 exercises that will keep you moving forever, right? Period. Like, I think that if we look at how people train, a lot of people train isolation, right? Hypertrophy work is isolation. There's kind of, I think it's coming closer together, but a while ago, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, there's like two sides of the spectrum. There's like isolation training, hypertrophy, bodybuilding, and then there's, functional training, crawling on the ground, like edging towards CrossFit and other modalities of training that claim to be more function based. I say that word claimed very intentionally here because I think if we're trying to focus on function, depending on our definition of that, but I like to go by the definition of function as biomechanics and anatomy dictates, right? How our joints move in isolation and how our joints move in integration. That to me is function, right? And then of course there's other components to it, like our cardiovascular system and, force absorption, force production. Like, yes, there's layers to this, but in its kind of most distilled down form, function to me is how the joints move in isolation and how they move in integration. So that's the kind of basis for how I'm going to define things as I go through this episode today. And I'm going to talk about, so Shao went in on isolation. And isolation training is great because as we look at these things, and he didn't go full isolation, there's compounds and like other things, but as we look at muscles in isolation, how they move joints in isolation, we can get a lot from that. And I think the benefit of that is it's very objective, right? Especially if I'm talking like a seated hamstring curl or a preacher bicep curl or like a dumbbell row. Like as I look at each of these things, this to this week over week, it's very one-to-one. We can have a very close comparison. Of course, there's always going to be multiple variables week to week and all this stuff, but it's very objective in nature, is that I can look at reps, sets, load, duration, all of these things, and I can see like, okay, over 6, 8, 12 weeks, I've seen this trajectory of progress in these movements, which is fantastic. And objective progress is a huge motivating factor for people that exercise, myself included. I want to see heavier weights on the bar. I want to see them getting more reps. I want to see that I'm getting stronger. I want to see the objective progress in what I do. I think the thing that comes before that and perpetuates this for a long period of time is what I call like functional training by the definition that I just said. It's like understanding how your joints move in isolation, in integration, and enhancing or at least sustaining your ability to do that for long periods of time, right? I trained Olympic weightlifting for, 15 years now. And with that, the movement patterns are very repetitive. And granted, with Olympic weightlifting, maybe a little different than powerlifting or shot putting or, a golf swing. Like they're all very specialized movements. Olympic weightlifting, it requires a lot of range of motion, a lot of stability, a lot of balance through it. But the thing is, the more repetitive your training is, the more you get pigeonholed into specific movement patterns. And that just is. That's not good. That's not bad. That's just how things are, right? And you have to do that to be a high performer in any sport, is you have to become the shape of the sport. The thing about that, though, is that creates a very predictable pattern of repetitive wear and tear, repetitive stress on your body, on your joints. And I can't think of any all-encompassing sport that is based around joint function, right? Like the way you split jerk a barbell. There's ways that you can do it that are better for your joints and worse for your joints, but it's still a ton of force on the SI joint, on a lot of compressive force on the spine, like fucking elbows, wrists. Like there's going to be a lot of wear and tear as you become the shape of a split jerk, as you become the shape of, a baseball pitcher, as you become the shape of whatever sport you're talking about. Like powerlifting's one that's powerlifting, weightlifting are easy examples because they're sports that you kind of compete at in the gym, right? Training for the sport is kind of competing in the sport in a lot of ways. So if we think of these things and the way they pigeonhole us into movements, is a degree of that is necessary, but as we become the shape of that sport or the shape of that movement, we're losing the capacity to get out of the shape of that movement, right? And that's the approach that I want to take for this episode, is that I've met a ton of great athletes in my life. I've been very lucky to get hands-on experience working with very high performers. And something that I've noticed in every single high performer that I've worked with is that they're not just a high performer in the sport that they specialize in, right? That athleticism, that skill of being an athlete and being a high performer, it has lateral application to other things that they do in life, whether that's something as different as like running a business or something as different as maybe this was a COVID thing, but almost every athlete that I know, like professional athletes, football players, baseball players, they play their sport, but then they fucking go golfing, right? Like golf is this other thing that they do, and they're very fucking good at it. So there is that lateral application of athleticism. And that's something that even in athletic development in younger kids, that's something that there's kind of a body of research saying that the sooner they specialize, the less time they will spend in that sport. And it's the reason is exactly what I'm getting at here, is that as you become the shape of the sport, you lose the ability to get out of that shape, right? So for younger athletes, for like children, teens, even kind of getting towards like high school to collegiate athletes, like it's better for athletic development to play multiple sports, because if you play, what's the spring sport? Soccer? Who plays sports in the spring? Soccer in springtime. If you play basketball, no. If you wrestle in the wintertime and then you play baseball or track and field, in the summertime, then like you're going through and you're getting such a different stimulus from each of these sports that it forces you to be very well rounded in your athletic development, right? As opposed to, the 8-year-old kids that are on travel ball teams that play baseball from September to September every single year. Like there is something to be said for skill development and frequency of exposure. Yes, absolutely. But if that ends up in a Tommy John surgery in high school or their second year in college, then you're stunting their athletic development long term, because they became so much the shape of a pitcher that they couldn't get out of that shape, and they started to stress structures where they shouldn't have been stressing structures. And then there goes the UCL. There's the Tommy John. Maybe they're, they're a year in recovery. Maybe they're not throwing the same speed or velocity that they were. So there are negative implications for not being able to reach outside of the shape of your sport. And that's the perspective that I'm going to take on this episode, where kind of getting back to the original point is that there's a lot of really good objective progression we can have in isolation, in isolated movements, as we look at training isolated body parts or body regions, right? Even like, a deadlift isn't necessarily an isolation movement, but in terms of like where we're stressing, it's more of an isolated lower body workout. Like no bodybuilders do a deadlift or an RDL on their upper body day to grow their delts or their traps, right? Maybe they do. I don't know. That's very, very all-encompassing thinking if they are. But that's not the intention. That's not the primary intention, right? Maybe it's tertiary or quaternary to the point. What I'm getting at is that there's a lot of ways that we can have subjective progress in training that carries over to enhance the objective progress that we're chasing. And as we look at this stuff, there are ways you can objectify it, but I think the best way to track this metric of progress is not necessarily I performed better in terms of weight, in terms of reps, in terms of bar speed, in terms of velocity, whatever objective metric you're talking about. I think the way that this kind of rationale around training ripples into increased performance is I feel better doing X, Y, Z. Right. And this is something that I put even before, like, this is maybe if Shallow's episode was, these are the best exercises you can do for these things. This would be almost like a prerequisite is these are the best things, the best exercises you can do to make sure that you can do every single exercise that he mentioned for the rest of your fucking life. And that's the approach that I'm going to take to today. So with that, I've boiled this down to 4 exercises. 4. I don't even need my thumb to count this on one hand. 4 exercises that you can build your program around. And I've built, I don't know, programs for hundreds of people around these 4 movement qualities, we'll say. Maybe not these 4 specific exercises, but these 4 movement qualities. And not saying that this overrides any of the things that Shallow talked about in the previous episode. I'm saying this will enhance your ability to perform on those exercises if we look at movement in this way. All right. So now we have set some context. I'm going to drink some of this cold brew coffee and take a breath. That's the thing about recording these episodes on your own, is that I've all this shit in my brain and I need to get it out of my mouth. And me getting it out of my mouth directly conflicts with me breathing. So sometimes I need to remember to breathe. But as we start here, I want to think about not just in isolation what's happening, but I want to think about the integration of how these movements allow us to coordinate and kind of connect different body regions as we go through each of them. All right. So we're going to start from the bottom up. Number 1, I'm going to start with the dumbbell walking lunge. All right. And I know this is on Shallow's list. I listened to the episode. I skimmed the episode. I think dumbbell walking lunge is the gold standard of lower body function. And as I go down this list today, this is kind of what I'm getting at. This is gold standard, and each of these will have a regression. And I'd keep in mind that the regression for these things might be 3 different movements. And that's something that we can expand on in the future. We can talk about it. If you guys are in the Prescript labs, we can bring it up. We can have conversations about it. But these are going to be very complex movement patterns. And the reason for that is that it's going to integrate, like I said, different body regions with the intention of allowing a level of stability, range of motion, coordination, and awareness, really, that transfers to allow us to train for a long period of time. So if you're not, or your clients are not at a point where they can do this complex of a movement yet, the goal is to get them to the point where they can do these 4 movements and they could do them forever. And once you get to that point, you're at a point where you have enough awareness, you have enough stability, you have the range of motion to do any other movement in the gym long term, and it will enhance your ability to train for a longer period of time. Okay, so back to number 1, dumbbell walking lunge. Now, there's a ton of benefit to a dumbbell walking lunge globally throughout every single body region. And we can start with some of the more minors, is that holding dumbbells in your hand, to be able to have the grip strength to do this, and if we're talking like a set of 20 reps or 20 steps, like it's a sustained period of time that's like, I don't know, 40 seconds to a minute, depending on how quickly or slowly you move. But the grip strength that requires, it's going to, the bottleneck to grip strength is going to be stability through the wrist, the elbow, the glenohumeral joint, and the scapulothoracic joint, right? So for us to be able to stabilize and coordinate all of those things, and there is a degree of kind of scapular rotation that is important here. And we'll talk about this more as we get to the upper body, but I'll circle back to that point. But essentially saying that I'm going to hold on to dumbbells for a minute, give or take, is saying that I have the ability to coordinate upper body stability enough to produce force distally, as distally as it gets, my hand. So that's one of the, like I said, that's further down the list, but that is kind of one of the considerations of this being on this short list of 4 exercises. That's the benefit through the upper body. Now, through the core, not as much benefit through this movement particularly as there is the next one or some of the other ones that I'll say on this list, but it's axial compression, right? So it gives us some sort of stimulus of us learning the strategy to deal with axial compression against low. So with that, I think axial compression helps enhance our understanding of core bracing versus shear force, like a shear force through the spine. That really forces us to execute on our spinal bracing. It requires a lot more awareness. It's not as intuitive. So that's something that is a bit more of a learning piece. Compression makes it a little bit easier. So with that, everything's like the gravitational forces are pulling straight down in alignment with our spine as we go through this. Now, that is kind of getting us to the primary benefit of this is as we look at the integration of body regions. Yes, we have the shoulder, but really what I'm going to focus on here is the connection of the foot to the pelvis and lumbar spine. All right, that's the integration that we're going to learn through a walking lunge. So as we go through this, we're going through kind of gait cycle blown out of proportion to its fullest extent, right? Our front leg, we're in hip flexion, abduction, external rotation. In our rear leg, we're getting into extension, internal rotation, and adduction. So we're taking the hip through generally full range of motion. There's a good degree of rotation, that ball and socket joint at the hip, where you'll notice a theme as we go through these. Rotation is stability, right? The way that we stabilize at the joints that require the most stability in our body, and that would be essentially our hip, the ball and socket of our hip, the ball and socket of our shoulder, and we can even look at the spine in this way. Like, this is another aside, is that movement is rotation, right? We are rotating through one or multiple planes, actually all planes always. But if we look at which plane we're primarily moving through, like an RDL, it's rotation through that sagittal plane, right? If that makes sense. So as we look at stability on the whole, rotation is going to be the primary quality that I'm looking at, right? So and rotation not necessarily aligned with gravity. Like in RDL, we're moving through the sagittal plane. We're kind of rotating in alignment with gravity. We're talking 90 degrees, like rotation at the hip. We're talking internal, external rotation. We're working not independent of gravity, but within a different plane than gravity is acting on us. And that is stability. So what I'm learning is I'm learning to connect the way that my hip moves, and for my hip to move through full range of motion here, I need to have stability at the pelvis. So that creates a demand for core stability or some sort of understanding of how to resist movement at the pelvis and allow movement at the ball and socket of the hip, which is it's going to transfer to every single movement that was on Shallow's list for the lower body. Is sometimes there's external stability involved, sometimes there's not. The less external stability we have, the more we need to create internally for us to have a level of output that will have any sort of impact on our performance, period. So we're learning how to stabilize the pelvis while control the movement at the hip. And then from here, important link, the thing that we're not going to get from too many other exercises, is the implication of hip rotation through all three planes on how our foot contacts the ground, right? We need to have some sort of coordination. It goes both ways between how we're moving at the hip and how it's going to influence our foot strike on the ground, and where we bear weight on that foot, where our foot pressure is, where essentially our base of support, our balance is. That's going to be our foot. And then vice versa, is that the awareness at the foot allows us to get into the requisite positions at the hip. Like if I don't have any understanding of foot pressure, then I'm just going to be compensating through tibial rotation, through rotation at the hip joint, and then probably upstream into the SI joint, the lumbar spine, the contralateral shoulder. So dumbbell walking lunge, the benefit here, kind of all the way around, is we're understanding how we're building an understanding and awareness and a capacity to execute on how foot pressure relates to hip rotation. We have that kind of link between pelvic stability, or like core activation, and hip movement, and the integration into all the way downstream to the foot. And then I kind of mentioned this, but the way that the orientation of our rib cage to our pelvis is going to affect our ability to stabilize at the scapula, and then distal to that for the grip strength. So number one spot, these aren't in order. They're all number one for 4 different intentions. So number one spot for this intention, connecting the foot to the hip and even the shoulder, dumbbell walking lunge. Number 2. Now, this one, a lot of overlap, but we're kind of tipping the scales. It's going to be a B stance RDL. And anyone who's listened to me say anything for the past, I don't know when I got onto this, maybe 7 years, has probably heard me talk about the B stance RDL in one capacity or another. The reason I think this is such a valuable movement is now we're kind of doing all the same things I just mentioned, is that we're learning to integrate foot pressure to hip rotation, to core stability, to rib cage, to pelvis orientation, to scapular stability, to distal grip strength. We're doing all of those things. But if we had an intensity dial on the dumbbell walking lunge, that intensity dial is dialed more towards lower body. And now the intensity dial on the B stance RDL is kind of tipped more towards pelvis, core, rib cage orientation, right? It's going to put all these things on trial, because I mentioned earlier in the dumbbell walking lunge, it's a lot more up and down movement, right? It's a lot more compressive forces through the spine, through the torso, through the way that we're going to use the core to resist gravity. Now, as we do a dumbbell B stance RDL, and this is with a contralateral load, this is going to put a ton of shear force on the spine, right? If our spine is parallel to the ground, if our torso is horizontal, gravity is acting perpendicular to the torso. So the way that our spine is best equipped to disperse force is top to bottom, right? Not front to back, back to front. So for us to maintain pelvis to rib cage proximity, it puts a lot more demand on the musculature of the torso, of the core, to be able to maintain that position. And then that's very kind of proximately, like close to midline. And as we go layers out from that, that turns out being the relationship, kind of the posterior oblique sling of one glute to the contralateral lat, right? From hip to shoulder. So the way that we're doing this now, foot pressure is going to be important. Absolutely. This is no different. It's a lot less dynamic in the way we're moving the lower body. So this is something that you have a lot better control over, where your weight is in the foot, kind of your base of support that you're building. And now as we deviate our center of mass, as the hips go back, now torso is becoming more parallel to the floor. Now it requires a lot more stability through buffering shear force through the spine, and particularly in anti-rotation. Now, the way that I perform a B-stance RDL, if you guys have seen it, there's a lot of the rotational component here. And I want to be very clear that the rotation through a B-stance RDL is happening through the ball and socket of the hip joint. Completely, right? There's 100%. There is not any dynamic rotation through the torso or the rib cage as I do this. Now, that's an important distinction, because, and that's probably one of the number one things that I'll cue people, is that we're not reaching for the ground. Like, people that do these very poorly, they'll kind of hinge over, then they'll reach for the ground. They'll get this kind of over protraction. They'll rotate through the thoracic spine, through the rib cage, and that's not what we're looking for here, right? We're looking for the ability to stabilize and buffer shear forces through rotation, through that posterior oblique sling, and through the abdominal musculature, the core musculature, as we get into that hinge position. So the important thing here is that we're establishing foot pressure. We're going to make sure that we're able to keep pressure on the medial side of the foot, like under that big toe. We're letting the foot flatten as we go through this. We're setting a trajectory through the hips towards internal rotation and adduction, adduction at the hip from the start. And then we're moving right through that plane, that kind of oblique plane that we've already set the trajectory for. So as we look at that, it's essentially what that is. We're eccentrically lengthening the external rotators of the hip, which are big muscles, our glutes, the entire rotator group, our piriformis. What we're doing is we're lengthening those against eccentric load, which is incredibly potent when it comes to increasing range of motion, increasing stability. Right? A lot of times when people lack stability at the hip, it's because they're shortened through the external rotators. So they have this bias towards external rotation, which has implications downstream on femoral, on tibial rotation, on the way that they foot strike with more lateral foot pressure. So for us to restore and maintain that range of motion, we need to have eccentric load through lengthened positions, right? And that's going to be another theme that you'll see with primarily one of our upper body exercises. So B-stance RDL, we're setting the trajectory through full foot pressure, through internal rotation, intentional internal rotation of the hip, and then we're resisting any rotation through the torso as we hinge. And that's a big part of why I chose this as one of this and one other of the primary movements of our 4 movements that you need to do to be able to move forever. Because there's 2 ways we want to be able to use our core, and we want to be able to use it to resist and transfer force, right? And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I have a dumbbell in my hand. I'm primarily loading glutes and hamstrings here. I'm creating movement through the hip, and I'm transferring that to the dumbbell in my hand. So this is purely about transferring force while buffering rotational force through the torso. Now, rotational force is important here because it is more complex to either resist movement or control movement through rotation than it is through purely sagittal plane or purely frontal plane, because there are kind of components of all 3 planes as we look at the transverse plane. As we look at rotational movement, it's going to, if we have an increased capacity to buffer force through rotation, that is going to transfer to our capacity to buffer force through lateral flexion and through flexion extension. And that doesn't transfer the other way, not to the same degree, right? If you're really good at buffering force through the sagittal plane, through flexion extension, that doesn't necessarily mean you have that same capacity to buffer it through rotation. And I'm not necessarily saying that this creates the same capacity, but there is a better transfer for buffering force from rotation to increasing your capacity to buffering force through flexion extension than there is vice versa, the other way, right? So that's why this is a very important key component to why this is on the list. All right. So dumbbell walking lunge, kind of coordinating foot into pelvis, B stance RDL, more so it is foot to pelvis, but this is more so kind of pelvis to shoulder, right? Pelvis through torso to shoulder. So dumbbell walking lunge, number one, also number one, B stance RDL, contralateral load. Now we're going to move towards the upper body. There's two lower and two upper bodies. Now, number one, for the upper body, I'm going to put this as the first one I'm going to address is going to be a pressing movement. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, each of these is a fairly complex movement pattern, and there are regressions to these that are appropriate, and the regressions to these may be multiple exercises, right? The regression to a B stance RDL might, for someone, it might be a dead bug, it might be a bilaterally supported single leg RDL, and it might even be a calf raise, like a seated calf raise. Like there's components of the B stance RDL that each of those is going to teach you, and you have to have an understanding of each of those three things to be able to do a B stance RDL with a contralateral load well. But if you don't have that capacity to do it well, you might need to break it down into these isolated components. So keep that in mind as we go to this next one, because it's kind of dumb. Like dumb in the sense that it's a dumb arrangement of things to be put together, and it's not as intuitive as like, I want bigger biceps, I'm going to do bicep isolation. This is, I want a better ability to integrate body regions, so I'm going to train things that force me to integrate these body regions. So as we move to the upper body, in the first number one spot here, I'm going to put, this is on a cable stack. So cable is going to be set to probably a little bit above hip height as you're standing. Cable is going to be behind you. And I'm going to do an ipsilaterally loaded unilateral cable press in an isometric lunge with full torso rotation. Pause. We'll take a second to let that kind of sink in, and then we'll kind of put this together into why this specific arrangement of way too many variables is on this short list of things that you should be able to do if you want to use your body forever. So we'll start with the isometric lunge hold. Isometric lunge hold is something that I prescribe to 100% of the people that I work with, just because there's so much benefit in awareness and like mind muscle connection of holding a lunge position and not falling over while being able to increase your stability there and have awareness around full foot pressure, creating a very stable base of support in that lunge position, and then being able to maintain your center of mass over that base of support. And then a step further is doing it dynamically while there's some sort of movement in the upper body. All right. So this is kind of continuing that link from the floor, from our foot pressure up through kind of pelvis control, hip rotation. And now the difference between this and our B stance RDL is static control over shear forces through rotation in the spine. Now, this is dynamic control over dynamic force production through rotation in the spine or through the torso. So that's an important component. And the reasoning is exactly the same to why we had the B stance RDL and its benefits through the core being through rotation primarily, and not saying that isolated work through resisting and creating movement through flexion extension and lateral flexion aren't important. They're building blocks to get to this kind of end of spectrum progression gold standard. And the reason for that is because if you can control and produce force through rotation, that tells me you have a really good understanding of how to use your core that will transfer to controlling and creating movement and producing force through both lateral flexion and flexion. But back to kind of the specifics, I can say it. The specifics on this exercise that is so obscure, but has made the top 4 list of movements that I think people should be doing. We have the benefits to the isometric lunge hold. Great. Now let's talk about the ipsilateral load. So if I'm, say, pressing on my left hand with this cable that is behind me for a horizontal pressing movement, and my left leg is also forward, what that does, that left leg, it creates a block for pelvic rotation, right? Really the split stance creates a block for pelvic rotation. So what that means is that it's essentially impossible for me to have stable foot pressure and rotate through the pelvis as I go through this movement. So we're isolating the movement, not at the pelvis, but more so at the thoracic spine. And thoracic rotation is a very important component for both buffering forces into the lumbar spine, being able to isolate and differentiate thoracic rotation from lumbar rotation. But it's also a very important component to shoulder function, right? Is the more variability we have through anterior to posterior, posterior to anterior rotation to the rib cage gives us greater variability in the way that we can stabilize the scapula on the rib cage. A lot of people, kind of like I said, people in the lower body, they have rotational biases. It's typically external rotation with a lack of stability. Through the rib cage, there's a structural component that will predispose people to one side or the other. So I won't say that, one is more prominent than the other. Maybe I will. I don't know. But this is more specific to the person than specific to a specific movement pattern or bias. But chances are that people are stuck in one side of that rotational arc. And that could mean that someone's stuck in flexion with kind of that anterior tilt to the scapula, or they're stuck more so in thoracic extension with like over retraction of the scapula. Either of those person, they're going to get a greater benefit from being able to rotate that rib cage to a greater degree in terms of scapular stability, because the way that we stabilize the scapula on the rib cage, I think of it as if you put like 2 dinner plates, one on top of the other. That's how the scapula should articulate with the rib cage. Now, if we take a bowl and we put it under that dinner plate, that's kind of like changing the shape of the rib cage, right? It's if the shape of the rib cage is not synonymous with the shape of the scapula, which we can't change the shape of the scapula. That is what it is. We can change the shape of the rib cage because the rib cage is a bunch of bones that are manipulated by muscles, right? That's how we create movement. So if those two things are not synonymous or as synonymous as possible, that's where we run into issues because there's just less contact between the scapula and the rib cage. So by increasing someone's capacity to change the shape of the rib cage, we are now increasing their capacity to stabilize their scapula. So, isometric lunge position. Great. Ipsilateral load, blocking the pelvis on the side that we are creating the rotation. Now, the reason I like this because I'll do both. I'll do this as a press and I'll do this as a pull. The reason I like the press in this case is because my other upper body movement is going to be a pull movement that I think has unique components because of the way that it eccentrically loads that I think needs to be on this list. So this was by necessity that I chose a press. I'm not saying that a pull isn't a good variation for this as well. But with the press, now what's happening is we're eccentrically loading into that posterior rib cage rotation. Eccentric load is a great way to increase someone's capacity to move because we are creating length in shortened tissues against load. So that's going to be an impactful way for the nervous system to recognize that we have the capacity to move this way and we can stabilize it, right? So that's why this is here. That's why it's a pressing movement, but specifically for that eccentric load through posterior rib cage rotation and shoulder extension, right? So as we get into shoulder extension, that's going to demand a degree of internal rotation at the shoulder. We're going to have a degree of scapular depression, which will have to be kind of, that's an awareness piece of this. So that may be another thing that you need to break this into more simple components to get someone to understand that's how they depress the scapula. So they're not biasing shoulder elevation, scapular elevation. But the eccentric load through posterior rotation is the rib cage, through shoulder extension and shoulder internal rotation. These are all main components of why this is on the list. And then from there, the concentric loading of pressing, and there should be posterior rib cage rotation on the pressing side as they go into shoulder extension, and there should be anterior rotation of the rib cage paired with scapular depression and protraction as they go through the pressing component of this. So this is now linking from the foot to the hip, stability through the pelvis, kind of by the positioning that we have allocated to this, stability through the lumbar spine as a result of that, and then variability. So this is the difference between the B stance RDL and this ipsilaterally loaded unilateral isometric lunge cable press with torso rotation, is that now we are dynamically creating and controlling rotation through the torso and through the rib cage. Okay? So we've gotten number 1 for the lower body, dumbbell walking lunge. Number 1, again, for the lower body, contralaterally loaded B stance RDL. Number 1 for the upper body, ipsilaterally loaded isometric lunge cable press with torso rotation. And our final number 1 for the upper body to complete our 4 movements that you should be doing to be able to move forever is going to be now on the cable stack again. We have a contralaterally loaded half kneeling high cable pull down. All right. So let's kind of break this apart. Now, we're kind of taking the feet out of the equation for this one, and we're biasing the upper body a bit more. And if you can see, we've turned that dial in a specific direction as we went through each of these 4 movements, as we started more emphasis on foot, on base of support, then turned it a bit more towards pelvis, to resisting movement through the torso, and then a bit more from pelvis to rib cage, scapula, shoulder, and even distal to that, like our hand. And now this is going to be even more turning that dial towards upper body, scapula, rib cage, shoulder, upper body mechanics. So as we take the feet out of the equation, we're now half kneeling, right? We've switched to now a contralateral load. So that means if I'm half kneeling, my right knee is on the ground, my left hip is flexed, and my foot's on the ground there, and I'm holding my cable or my cable attachment on my right hand. So the hand that the knee is down. And the idea here again, kind of doubling down, tripling down, quadrupling down on that idea that eccentric load in lengthened tissue increases our capacity to move. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're forcing someone to lengthen from the bottom up. We could integrate the quads here. We're getting into hip extension, knee flexion is a more lengthened quad position. We're kind of blocking that hip into extension. We want to maintain a neutral pelvic position, which a big benefit to this is lengthening even more kind of internally the psoas, getting into a lengthened psoas position, which will increase our capacity to get into hip extension. Now, the conscious control component of this is maintaining that rib cage down, right? Pelvis to rib cage proximity is that we want to be able to pull the rib cage down so that we're not getting into this extended thoracic and global extension through the spine. A little bit of thoracic flexion even gives us a better leverage through the rib cage to load the lats. Rib cage as the fulcrum to the lats. And if we're thinking still posterior oblique sling, my left hip is flexed and I'm getting into shoulder flexion on my right side. So I'm able to build tension through kind of a lengthened glute on that left side into a lengthened lat on that right side now because of the orientation of the body. And now with that, I'm able to create eccentric load through that unilateral pull down as I go up, right? Now just like in the B stance RDL, where we talked about the benefits of eccentrically loading the muscles of rotation or the lateral hip structures, that's going to allow us a better capacity to rotate through the hip on the whole. Now, lengthening the lats with control over scapular position. So there still needs to be control over scapular depression here. That will allow us to lengthen the lats and grant us a greater capacity to move through shoulder flexion in the future. Okay. Now, as we talked about the dumbbell walking lunge earlier, one of the benefits that I brushed over was scapular downward rotation, right? As I put a dumbbell in my hand, gravity and that dumbbell are going to pull my shoulders away from my ears. As that happens, there's going to be a downward tilt, so downward rotation to the scapula there, which there's a benefit to this because as we concentrically downwardly rotate, we're creating eccentric length through the muscles that upwardly rotate the scapula. Okay, and we already know, because I've said it about 5 times already, that there's a benefit in terms of increasing range of motion to creating eccentric length in specific structures that resist us from getting into range of motion that may be less stable. Now, what we're doing is we're creating eccentric control over the muscles that create upward rotation at the scapula, right? So with this movement, this is going to be one that I'd say particularly a tempoed eccentric is going to bring a lot of benefit. Not saying that's not true with the B stance RDL in particular, or that rotational press that we talked about, but a huge benefit of this is eccentrically loading into scapular upward rotation, because that will grant us a greater capacity to then go ahead and concentrically load scapular upward rotation. Okay. So as we go through this, we're kind of, if we talk about the benefits of the shoulder now, with that insanely constrained press that I talked about, I said one of the benefits of that was that we were getting into shoulder extension with internal rotation at the shoulder. Now, as we go overhead, we're getting into shoulder flexion with external rotation at the shoulder, right? And that's going to require scapular upward rotation. It's going to require to get into full scapular upward rotation. There's going to be a greater demand to maintain scapular depression to allow us to keep that scapula on that rib cage, that kind of dinner plate analogy, so that we can maintain stability through scapula to rib cage so that we can now create more force or resist more force into that shoulder itself. So with our number one choice for the upper body, our half kneeling contralateral loaded lat pull down, I'd say a neutral grip on this, because again, a neutral grip is going to be an expression of external rotation of the shoulder. Now what we're doing is we're kind of blocking the pelvis. That dial has been turned more towards upper body function than lower body, and upper body integration than lower body. So now as we look at this, pelvis has been blocked. There's no movement through the pelvis. We have to have some sort of control to create that rib cage orientation that is going to allow us to use the rib cage as a fulcrum to load the lats through that posterior oblique sling. And we're eccentrically loading the lats while we're eccentrically, kind of both controlling scapular rotation and shoulder rotation. So we've turned that dial more towards upper body function and integration now. We're going to take a second to get a sip of coffee here and let that sink in. So, as we kind of look at these 4 movements, all of them ranked number 1 in terms of function, just turning that dial more towards our relationship with gravity in the lower body and our relationship with kinesthetic awareness through the lower body, more towards the upper body as we went from beginning to end of that list. These are 4 movements that can exist within a program with every single movement that Shao had on his list. They don't need to happen in isolation, and a lot of the movements I'm sure that were on his list are going to be things that you can use as a regress component to increase someone's capacity to perform these movements. So as we think of this list, when I have a client that's, rehabbing an injury, if they are coming for me, or if they're coming to me more so in terms of increasing performance, whatever their goal is, if we look at these 4 movements or these kind of 4 movement pattern integrations that we went through, and we see where they're at in proximity to this being end of spectrum gold standard, and we could come up with regressions from these movements that are appropriate for that client at that specific time, and we can get them to move towards better competency through each of those components, with the end goal being getting them to be able to execute on every single one of these movements and do that as their ongoing maintenance. They're going to have improvement. I can absolutely guarantee you that they will have improvement, because if you can integrate your body through these 4 movements in these 4 ways, I can't think of something that won't allow you to do, pending coordination of a skill. So that last sentence is kind of important. This gives you the physical capacity to do what you are capable of, what your body is capable of. And then on top of that, you just need to layer in skill learning to make it more specific to their goals. So if we're looking at designing a program for someone, a lot of people that I train, they have 4 days. Sometimes preference condenses that into more or less. But if you have 4 days, you can pick one of these 4 movements and you can have them. There's 2 things I want to say. You can have them do whichever regress components of these 4 movements, kind of play towards getting better at one of these 4 for that day. And then you can have them do isolation or output exercises in that same session, right? And the idea of these, and the reason that you can do those things simultaneously, is because none of these are high output, high fatigue movements comparatively, right? Dumbbell walking lunges will get you really tired because we're integrating a lot of musculature. It will get the heart rate up. There's a lot of fatigue, but it's a lot lower output than a leg press, than a back squat, than even like a split squat. So it's going to be something that you can do simultaneously while picking any single exercise on the list that Shao will put together for you. They can coexist because of fatigue management, right? These are going to be self-regulated. There's going to be some sort of auto-regulation around loading, lower fatigue, higher coordination pieces that you can put earlier on in a workout and then have them fucking kill themselves on a leg press or a machine chest supported row or some input any other exercise here, as they can coexist together, right? So that's kind of, I guess I'll put a bow on this at this point. We're getting to an hour now. Thank you if you're still here. Thank you for fucking listening for an hour. But the idea that I really wanted to kind of drive home with this episode is that when we're looking at increasing function, that is synonymous with increasing performance. And there can be a very simple blueprint that we use to be able to do that. And I think these 4 movements check every single box that needs to be checked for someone that has a lack of capacity in range of motion, in stability, in coordination, in awareness. And if you can get someone to move from wherever they're at towards a level of competency in these 4 movements, you will see an improvement, whether their goals are hypertrophy, whether their goals are to go to the NFL and they're preparing for the NFL draft, whether they want to golf on the weekends, whether they're coming back from an ACL replacement, or whether they just had a labrum surgery. If you keep these in mind as end of spectrum movements, and not everyone will get there, but if you figure out the appropriate regressions to move them towards each of these specific intentions that I chose each of these exercises for, then you will see progress with them. If you disagree, tell me. Fucking hit me and tell me. But I think that's pretty airtight. So thanks for listening, guys. Interested to hear your opinions on this. If you're listening right now, I know I should have said this at the beginning, but if you're still here, make sure that you guys subscribe. Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Android. If you have an Android, go get an iPhone. YouTube, subscribe to us on YouTube. We're really trying to push subscriptions lately. We put a lot of time and effort and thought into these podcasts, and we have for the past decade. So we want to show up higher on the lists of podcasts that people have the option to listen to, so we can extend our reach. And I appreciate you guys for being a huge part of that. Thank you for being here. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But I appreciate you guys. I'll see you soon.